Hello, my name is Myles Zhang, and today I'll be giving an oral presentation version of my senior thesis at Columbia. So my thesis is entitled The Church of Saint-Denis and the Origins of Gothic Architecture, and it uses this church as a case study for the history of Gothic architecture more broadly. The present narrative of medieval architecture oftentimes asserts a little bit more in the past than the present scholarship that the clergy and masons looked inward towards Saint-Denis for Gothic inspiration, and that the origins of the Gothic style of architecture, a really momentous shift in the history of architecture, originated from one structure and from the region surrounding Paris. But however, the argument of this thesis, of my thesis, is that the architectural story is possibly a little bit more complicated than a simpler narrative of clergy looking inward toward Paris and toward the center of the French Empire for architectural inspiration. We really have two styles in architectural history that we're talking about. We're talking about the Romanesque style of architecture with the rounded windows and the rounded features and the thick walls and the heavy buttresses. And we're talking also about the Gothic style of architecture with the pointed arches, the flying buttresses, the thinner walls, the glassy and light-filled interior. And so therefore the challenge is to identify this point of transition from the Romanesque to the Gothic style, and to ask the question, what factors brought about the introduction of the Gothic style? Now, one common source for citing the origins of the Gothic style is to look at Saint-Denis, to look at this one church, which was culturally influential because it was the center of the French Empire, the Capetian Empire in the 1100s, and very closely associated with the monarch. And historians often posited that other clergy in the region surrounding Paris, as a way to express fealty to the French monarch and to the royal family at that time, would model their local churches after Saint-Denis. I think that I would like to begin to challenge or to deconstruct this idea that there is the one original Gothic church, and to identify rather a variety of sources. So I think a good place to start here is to look at the construction sequence and the construction chronology of Saint-Denis, and that can begin to help us to unravel this narrative of transition from Romanesque to Gothic. So Saint-Denis originated around 754. It was a church in the Romanesque style, that is with the thick, heavy buttresses and walls. Around 1135 to 1140, under the leadership of a pretty influential abbot called Abbot Suger, who left a written narrative of his changes to the church, Saint-Denis was successively rebuilt in stages in what we now believe to be a mostly Gothic or semi-Gothic kind of style. So he began with the west facade of the church, and he moved around to the narthex and to the apse of the church. And around 1140 to 1144, working on the chevet part, that is the rear part of the church closest to the altar, the rounded part on the apse of the medieval church. We have two images. We have a picture with stained glass of Suger, probably created centuries afterwards. And we have an image of what this church possibly looked like around 1144, when Suger was about to die, and when he finished much of his work on this church. And one thing that immediately strikes me and other individuals about this church around the time of Suger's death is how it is not fully a Gothic church yet, and embodies many qualities of Gothic, yet it is not fully Gothic. For instance, the image, the facade right here, is in a pretty Gothic, semi-Gothic, although Romanesque style. The apse, that is the chevet part right here, is also in a pretty fully developed kind of Gothic style. But all of the crossing and all this area of the nave between the towers and the front and the rear is in a Romanesque style. This leads me to feel that the church was originally at the time of Suger, kind of a composite of multiple styles. Then around 1231, this original quasi-Romanesque, quasi-Gothic church was almost entirely demolished and rebuilt in the Renaissance or late Gothic style. And so this fact that little of the original church survives can lead us to begin to question the idea or the assertion that this church can or should be the first, given the amount of evidence that survives. And that was in the 1230s that it was rebuilt. Around 1792, during the French Revolution, it was desecrated. 1806, it was reconsecrated by Napoleon. And then around 1837, with reconstruction work by Debray and other architects, I think that something interesting begins to happen with the church when it is begun to be cast in a narrative of nationalism and in a narrative of state building. So the idea that this church is part of a larger architectural narrative, that it is a part of larger architectural narrative of nation building and empire building, and so how convenient, therefore, to situate the origins of the Gothic style in the center of the French Empire in Paris. And so I feel that there is a certain narrative beginning around 1848 and the revolutions of 1848 that Saint-Denis is part of a larger political agenda. Here we have this computer reconstruction I created. In red, we see the parts of the church that are original to Sujet, and then in the whitish tan color, we see parts of the church that are later additions. And this is what the model looks like. So as we can zoom around this model right here and look at the red parts and the white parts, we can see that really a lot of the church has not survived. So everything that is in white is a reconstruction from later editions or has been significantly changed. And only the red parts right here that I have highlighted are original to the church. This chevet right here, only the lower part of the apse, the upper part was reconstructed, and then only the lower part of the front. And the fact that these buttresses right here, as I'll talk about a little bit later, the fact that these buttresses are not original to the church can lead us to ask yet another question about the importance of flying buttresses, which are a central index of the Gothic style, the importance of these buttresses to Saint-Denis and to the understanding of the Gothic sense of construction to Saint-Denis. Here we have a few more images. We have images that are in this case colorized. So what I've done right here is I've taken these 3 photos of the church and I've only colored in the parts of the church that are original to Sujet. Everything else that is non-colored is a later addition. So here on one side we have the lower part of the chevet, the apse. So we can see here these very kind of almost rounded arches, which are very Romanesque, and above it the later Gothic additions. And I think that one of the challenges of analyzing Saint-Denis is to begin to disentangle all these later additions, to go back to the fundamental idea of what the church originally appeared like, and then to ask the same question again, how much is this church truly Gothic? And if it is not truly Gothic, can this church still therefore be identified as being the first of its kind or the first Gothic structure? Here we have another 360-degree interior panorama of what it looks like to step inside the church. This just gives you an idea of what the interior of the church is like. It's a small church by Gothic standards of a cathedral. It has many of the dimensions and proportions of a church much larger than its size. So all of these stained glass windows, most of these are later reconstructions. The nave right here is modeled after other Gothic churches that predate the construction of the nave, as well as possibly parts of the lower chevet that draw some inspiration, although limited inspiration, from earlier Romanesque or semi-Romanesque structures. So we have again here this idea of artistic borrowing, that Saint-Denis possibly borrows its 1230s features and its features original to the 1140s from other structures. So this idea here that so little of the church is original can lead to a lot of doubt surrounding parts that are now lost and are essential to reconstruct to understand the church's original appearance. So here we have one reconstruction. I'll walk you through 5 possible reconstructions. Not to say that I believe in one any more than I believe in others, but as a way to illustrate the amount of doubt that surrounds how this structure originally appeared. And because of the amount of doubt, therefore, the degree to which we can question the narrative, pretty strongly asserted narrative in the scholarship that this church was the first. So here we have a first reconstruction. This reconstruction shows a two-story elevation without a triforium. A triforium is a little gallery developed in some Romanesque and later Gothic architecture that separates the upper windows of the clerestory from the lower arches of this arcade. And it has no upper level support. So we look at this reconstruction right here, and it is in many ways squat. It's low to the ground. It's almost Romanesque. And if the architectural fabric, or if the surviving architectural fabric can allow us to reconstruct the structure in this way, I would say that it isn't really a truly Gothic or fully developed Gothic structure, because it lacks, in this reconstruction, lacks many of the features that we identify as essential to measuring Gothic architecture. That is, things like flying buttresses, or things like high vaulting and something that is really soaring above the ground. This first reconstruction also has possible areas that might have led to structural collapse, or might have, if this reconstruction is true, might have had some structural problems leading to later structural collapse, necessitating its rebuilding in the 1230s. And that just throws a little wrench in the narrative. Here we have a second reconstruction. This one right here shows a two-story elevation. It's a little bit more Gothic. There are upright buttresses that support the clerestory, but it's not yet fully Gothic. It has many Romanesque features, and this one is modeled after Saint-Martin-de-Champs, which I feel is a structure that possibly predates Saint-Denis as one of the first Gothic structures. Not as the first, but one of several that can be identified as an origin structure from which Saint-Denis drew inspiration. Here we have a third reconstruction. I've drawn all 5 of these reconstructions myself. This third reconstruction shows, again, a two-story elevation with this little bit of a triforium kind of gallery between them, as well as a combination of upright buttresses and hidden kind of quadrant arches in the roof right here. So again, we're moving to something that's a little bit more Gothic. And this one is possibly modeled, or is similar to Durham Cathedral, which is a Romanesque structure with flying buttresses. And so the complexity here is that we associate flying buttresses, this architectural feature, so deeply with the Gothic style, yet there are earlier structures from the medieval period, from the Romanesque period, and as early as Rome, that have buttresses, internal buttresses, or flying buttresses of some sort, such as Hagia Sophia. And so there's a certain narrative here that although we associate these stylistic features with Gothic architecture, many of them significantly predate. So here we have the fourth reconstruction. I know these might be a bit much to look at because there are so many of them, but I think the idea here is to show you that that the surviving architectural fabric can support many possible reconstructions of the original church, most of which, or many of which, are not fully or fundamentally Gothic in their appearance. So here we have a 3-story elevation with unsupported high vaults. That is high vaults right here, and the upper clerestory level that aren't supported by flying buttresses. Again, flying buttresses are a critical index of, I feel, the transition to Gothic architecture. And we have a fully developed clerestory right here. And then this one is closely modeled on Trinity Chapel, Canterbury Cathedral, which my faculty mentor Stephen Murray feels was modeled after Saint-Denis, and that we can possibly use the Trinity Chapel of Canterbury Cathedral as a possible model for how Saint-Denis originally appeared at Suger's time. And then here we have the 5th reconstruction, which is the most Gothic in appearance, that embodies almost all of the qualities of Gothic. So although currently only the lower arcade of this part of the church survives, the triforium right here, according to this reconstruction, is very Gothic. The upper levels right here of the clerestory are very Gothic. These vaults are long and attenuated. The windows are large. The flying buttresses are very thick and heavy, as modeled after Sens Cathedral. In this 5th reconstruction, which is very similar to Sens Cathedral, is the most Gothic in appearance, yet it is also in some ways one of 5, and not necessarily the only way to reconstruct this upper church. Sens Cathedral is possibly one of the other early sources of inspiration, or one of the early Gothic churches, although not as much scholarship has been written about that church because of its location, because it does not fit as conveniently into the narrative of empire building. It is not as essentially located geographically. It is not as associated with as charismatic a bishop or an abbot as Suger. In the next part of this presentation, I'll introduce Saint-Martin-de-Champs, another church in the Paris region that embodies many of the same Gothic qualities of Saint-Denis, and I'll begin to talk about how possibly Saint-Martin, because of its appearance originally, because its appearance was very similar, possibly very similar to Saint-Denis, that this church might in fact predate Saint-Denis, and that it might have inspired Saint-Denis, and that if Saint-Martin-de-Champs or earlier Gothic churches inspired Saint-Denis, I feel that it therefore becomes difficult to assert Saint-Denis as being the first of its kind, or the only or the first Gothic church, because it has realized it's a precedent-based church, according to my reconstructions and according to my analysis of this church's appearance. So here we have a floor plan of Saint-Martin-de-Champs. Again, we can see this comparison between left and right, Saint-Denis on one side and Saint-Martin on the other side, that externally, in terms of the floor plan of Chauvet, they are somewhat similar. So you have this ambulatory area that you can walk around. It's rounded on the end. It has these columns that divide the parts of the bays, and it has these rounded chapels that project slightly from the church, yet are connected on the inside and part of the same internal space. And this brings me to the near the conclusion of this presentation, that if we accept that Saint-Denis did not appear like it did in these two photos during Suger's lifetime, that is, during the lifetime of the abbot who built the church and during the period during which Gothic architecture is supposed to have originated, if we accept that the church did not appear this way, and that the original church resembled any of the 4 or 5 reconstructions presented here, and shown in this image right here, at least in the lower part of this image, if we accept any of these 4 reconstructions, then Saint-Denis originally resembled contemporaneous churches from the 1140s, such as Saint-Germain-de-Flies, Saint-Martin-de-Champs, Saint Cathedral, etc. And that it was one of several churches, one of several early Gothic or semi-Gothic, semi-Romanesque churches, again, churches that embody 2 styles, or possibly at the transition between the purely Gothic and the purely Romanesque style, and Saint-Denis was possibly one of several of these churches. And in conclusion, through my examination of Saint-Denis' architectural fabric, which I focused on mostly in this presentation, later changes to this fabric that obscure what the original may have appeared like, and how Suger describes this church, although I haven't as much focused on how Suger describes this church for shortage of time, but if you want to read how Suger describes the church and the importance of Suger to the narrative of Saint-Denis, you can read the accompanying full text of this thesis. But to summarize briefly, the fact that Saint-Denis is one of the only Gothic churches to have had someone write about them and write about the construction process of this church makes it very tempting to analyze this church in greater depth and to situate this church as important, even though it was possibly one of only many churches, although in this case one of the best documented medieval churches from this period. We therefore, or in this case I, conclude that Saint-Denis resembled contemporaneously constructed Romanesque and early Gothic churches, and that given these similarities, and the fact that so little of Suger's Saint-Denis survives, Saint-Denis cannot possibly be claimed as the first or the original Gothic church. It was rather one of numerous sources of inspiration for medieval masons to draw on. One last question that in this case, a rhetorical question that I'm asking is, why should this matter? And why should this matter is, I feel that it's important to construct narratives about architecture, and sometimes it is almost too tempting to construct a narrative about Gothic architecture that incorrectly situates one church or a single individual as this linchpin or this sudden transition from one style to another. And so for me it's a question of narrative building and creating more accurate narratives about architectural history that truly express that Gothic architecture originated from a variety of sources, from a variety of different inspirations that go as far back as ancient Rome, as the Romanesque period, and that it was not necessarily the invention of a single individual, a single genius in his mason, or a single client in their patron like Suger and the unnamed masons who worked for Suger, that ignited this important transition in Gothic architecture. And I feel that therefore, by recognizing the diversity of inspiration, of sources of inspiration for Gothic architecture, we can arrive at a better appreciation for what makes Gothic architecture unique and regionally diverse, as opposed to regionally convergent around Paris. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy reading my thesis.